Hello, world, and welcome to the Innovation Coaching Podcast. My name is Klaus Hostel, and with me today, I have Lee Kim. Lee, tell me how I can help.
So I just started a new job. So I've been doing human-centered design for the last 10 years, where people kind of expect what to happen, in terms of experience and innovation, prototyping, all those kind of things. And I just joined this new team this week. This is my first week, and it's a completely different environment. So coming from experience design perspective, I'm actually coming into a space design, and I do not know scope of work or expansion of cultural places. So right now I'm in New York, but I'll be working with people in China. I'll be working with people in Latin America. So I'm very used to working with people in New York, in America. So those are things that I'm kind of struggling to figure out, where do I start? How do I get to know how to have a conversation with people of different background, different expertise in ideas generation or kind of experimentations. So I'm just looking for a way to get started, maybe a little bit of a spark and maybe guidance on how to continue on.
I like that. I like that. And is it just you, or are you leading a team or part of a group, or what is the structure here?
Yes. So I'm leading a team of 5 individuals, people from kind of interior design background, change management background, and I'll be working with them. But I'm, part of a leadership group as well. So never worked with these people before. I just had meeting with them this week. Wonderful people. I'm really, really glad that the team was already formed and they are already in harmony with each other.
Okay, very nice. I guess one thing, and this is just a very, very simple, it might not solve all the problems, but it might at least break the ice a little bit, is one of the things I've seen done quite elegantly is creating a small, fun quiz on different work cultures, right? So if you Google what is Arabic work culture compared to Danish work culture, what is French work culture compared to Indonesian work culture, you'll get some interesting insights because a lot of people have written about this, right? I did that when I started working in the Middle East. I thought, okay, I need to know something about business culture in the Emirates where I was going, and later doing stuff in Saudi, Qatar, that sort of thing. And then I thought, okay, the first thing to do must be to just Google what is business culture in the Gulf region and in the Emirates compared to Denmark. And I found some nice websites that said, okay, here's what the Danes do. And then I said, okay, yeah, that's us. And then it said, here's what happens there. So that gave me a good comparison. It gave some traditions, some rituals, but also some mindsets. And that sort of thing is always useful, right?
Yeah.
Just Google is your friend, and now we have Chat GPT and resources like that is even easier. But one way that I've seen it done very elegantly, and sometimes copied this myself, is to make a short quiz, right? Let's say that you have these 5 team members and you make a Zoom meeting or some sort of online meeting, and you say, okay, we're going to do a short culture quiz to figure out how well do we know each other's working culture. And then it says, okay, being 5 minutes late to a meeting, is that okay in is that which culture is most okay with that? Is it the French guy, or is it the Indonesians, or is it the Arabs, or is it the people from Turkey, or is it the Portuguese? Whatever that looks like, right?
Yeah.
And especially if it's things that are fun. If it's saying who's a slacker and doesn't produce meaningful work, that's not nice. But if it's where is it okay to ask about people's family, or where do you go out and get drunk first in South Korean business culture, or is that more German business culture, right? These things that people can laugh about.
Yeah.
And both take some of the ones from your team, but also some other ones, because it's fun to laugh at each other. It's fun to laugh with each other. It's also sometimes fun to say, okay, at least none of us do that. And not only have I seen this work as a fun activity in itself, and it teaches some culture, it also opens up for some discussions, right? Because then you can say just the thing about being late. There are some business cultures where being late is just part of life, right? You're okay and things get in the way. And then there's others where being late, that is not cool. And being late twice, that is a serious problem. And neither is more right than the other. But if you're working together and one person thinks, an hour late is fine, and the other thing's 2 minutes late is the limit, and tomorrow it better be on time, then if there's no alignment and no discussion about it and no laughing together, then that can be pretty hard.
Yeah.
So very simple, very, very specific, but also very doable. A short business culture quiz doesn't solve everything, but it opens the conversation.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that. One of the things that I was just having a conversation with a person from Hong Kong this morning, and you can see that I'm wearing this crazy hat, and he was like, "When you come into the meeting tomorrow morning, please wear the hat because he wants to shock the other Asian people." And he was like, "We're having a hard time convincing them to have open mind about space utilization in different ways because maybe in Japanese or Korean or Chinese culture, it's important to have an office."
Mm-hmm.
How can you start having a conversation about, well, there are other ways that we can look at space utilizations, but how do you kind of have a way to see different perspective of utilizing space life when they are so used to doing it in one way?
I hear you. In general, if we're going to keep it a little bit general, I'd say that the trickiest thing, the hardest thing is to creating trust enough for people to be honest. Because once you get them to be honest, then you can ask all sorts of things and you can say, hey, in our group, let's agree on some rules. For example, how do we communicate? And what if you don't answer, should we expect that means yes? Or if you don't answer, should we expect that means no?
Yeah.
Is it okay to be wrong? Is it okay to correct somebody? Is it okay to say, hey, I need to interrupt? Like all these sorts of micro behaviors and agreeing on that in the team. However, you can't do that effectively until you've established trust. So my advice would be whatever you're trying to do, right? Whether it's thinking differently about an office or it's trying to establish workplace rules, as long as people are still not sure they trust each other, then you can't trust their answers. Right? If we've just met, we don't know each other, but there's already trust. And that means that if I ask you, Lee, if I'm going to be your coworker, would you prefer that if you do something that I find problematic, that I tell you discreetly, say, hey, Lee, that mail you're going to send out, I think that's a really bad idea? Or would you prefer that I tell you in front of the team, hey, Lee, that idea, I think that's a bad idea? Or would you prefer that I don't say anything about it, even though I think it? And then you can choose between these three options. And I think that you'll say, okay, either I want number one or I want number two, maybe number three, but at least you'll be honest about it. But if we don't have that trust, then you might say one and actually mean three. So the first thing in my experience is establishing that trust. And establishing trust is not easy, especially because there's only one way to establish trust, and that's by trusting first. If you go to somebody and say, hey, stranger, I think you should lend me $10,000, then most people will say, I think not. Where if you go to a stranger and say, hey, stranger, I saw you begging on the street, let me lend you $1,000. You can pay me back in 3 months. And they say, who are you? Why do you know me? Why do you trust me? I say, I don't know you, but I'm choosing to trust you, right? Maybe they'll give them back, maybe they won't. But if they do, and if they don't run out of your life, then when you come asking them for trust the other way, there's a pretty good chance that that trust is given. And one of the tricky things when building teams and when leading teams is when leaders say, trust me before I've trusted you, right? And as the leader and the culture bearer, one of your hardest tasks is to trust before people have earned your trust. And that means you're going to get burned. You're going to have people make mistakes. You're going to do things. But if you don't trust them first, then there's almost zero chance that they will trust you first. Yes, they might do what you ask of them, especially if you're their boss, but you can't trust them to be honest in situations that are tricky. Ask people in a workplace situation, hey, is a good colleague one that lies on your behalf or one that tells the truth when you're lying? Most people would say a good colleague is one that tells the truth when you're lying, but in reality, quite a few of them, they don't mean that. But getting to the point of them being honest enough about that to say, you know what, I actually think it's a sign of loyalty and camaraderie if a colleague tells a white lie, not a big one, like we don't want them to cover up murder, But if they tell a white lie to have my back, that means that I want to work with that person because I feel they'll have my back, even if it means a white lie, which is a much more normal, much more human and realistic answer. But very few people will give it unless they trust that they can be honest, right? We tend to be as honest as we feel we can be, and then a little bit more. And that means especially in cultures where there's strong authorities. If you work with somebody from India and you ask them about their boss, most of them will say, boss is great, lovely boss, no mistakes. And then when they talk to their friends, they're like, the boss is a bloody idiot. Complete but they would never say that. And if you come from the outside and say, hey, this is a safe space, you can talk about your bosses, they're like, yeah, we love the boss. And then turn around and go, the boss is an idiot. So the first thing is to establish that trust. And the only way to do that is to trust first. Show vulnerability first. Make mistakes first. Forgive first, even though that's not easy. And then, of course, you can use fun icebreakers, and you can use things where you play into culture, and you can use best practices from other people. That's great. There's a ton of inspiration out there. But the first and core thing is trust first if you want others to trust you, even if it's not easy.
Yeah. How do you begin to trust when you don't know them?
Well, how do you trust people in your life, right? Tell me a story of somebody that you now trust and you at one point didn't know them, right? So it's not your mother or your brother or somebody like that, but somebody you met and you trusted them before they trusted you. You've probably done that. We've all done that, right? Give me an example from your life of somebody where you chose to trust them even before they trusted you.
Yeah. I'm thinking about a friend. Since you talked about vulnerability, it was actually when I was asking a question about when was the last time you cried, and she shared a story of a night when her fiance died.
Wow.
And I wasn't expecting that, because that was the first time we weren't even a friend, and maybe she wasn't even thinking about sharing that, but at that moment, and I thought, wow, I almost feel guilty listening to that story, because I wasn't expecting to hear such vulnerability from like almost stranger, right?
That's a really nice example. And I've been part of some leadership network groups, and one of them, I remember we had this, here's a couple of minutes to introduce yourself, right? Say a little bit about who you are professionally and a little bit about who you are privately. And some people said, well, here I've been doing this for work, and I am married and have 2 kids and blah, blah, blah. And then one guy says, I recently lost my daughter. I think it was in a traffic accident, right? Something really terrible. And the next guy in line didn't share that because he was lucky enough. He hadn't lost his daughter, but he shared something that was also vulnerable. And then the next guy shares something that's also vulnerable, where if you are the one setting the tone, if you say, hey, I'd like us all here to get to know each other a bit. I'd like us to share one superpower and one thing we hate about ourselves. And you say, well, my superpower is that I have the ability to wear funny hats in serious situations, and my smile will light up the universe. And it's because it's a genuine smile. Okay, that's a nice superpower, right? That's pretty cool. And then you say, one thing I hate about myself, this is an example, I know it's probably not real. One thing I hate about myself is that I am bad at listening, for example, right? You seem to be pretty good at listening, Kim. So I feel I can make that as a joke. And then there's a good chance the next person will also say something nice about themselves, but they will probably also say something they're bad at because you've set the tone.
Yeah.
Where if you go in and say, my superpower is I'm super efficient, and my bad side is that I'm a little bit too efficient. Yeah. Really nice, right? That's going to be a different conversation.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah, being vulnerable first before asking others to be vulnerable, sharing your real self before. Yeah, so in order for me to learn about others, because trying to figure out how to start the team, right? Because like we don't know, they already know each other, and that's like I'm coming in where the culture is already established. So I'm trying to figure out who they are first, and then trying to figure out the team culture that we're going to be creating together. So that's something that I'm also thinking about, like how to do that. Start with the rituals, getting to know each other, starting something personal before we start the project. How do we speak the same language so that when we say yes, as you said, like, we meant yes. When we say no, we meant no. So those are the things I'm kind of thinking about right now as I'm going into the next week as a second week.
And I think on this that I love that you're doing this, because one of the things I see in a lot of teams is that they spend very little time on figuring out who the team is. Right? I heard a podcast some years ago with a Norwegian, I think he was a former colonel in the Norwegian army. And he'd been in the army for 26 years, something like that. And the interviewer was saying, okay, so you've been in the army. So I guess that part of your job has been to train people so that everybody was kind of standardized, right? Because in the army, you have certain tactics and ranks, and you have weapons and equipment and procedures, and there's a high degree of standardization. He said, yeah, you'd think that. But in reality, what you really do in army training, a lot of the work they did, at least in the Norwegian army, and I have a friend who's a major in the Danish one who said exactly the same later when I asked him about it. So I have it from two rather high-ranking officers who said, what we do is not try to make everybody the same, but we train and train so we know where people are strong and know where they're weak. And I said, interesting, tell me more. And he said, at that time, he had been in, he'd been, the Danish guy, he'd been in Afghanistan as a commander of a company. And he said he had one of his kind of, one of his close officers under him that really needed to have things in detail and very organized and very specific and needed like the dang, 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 dang. And then he would do his job well. No fluffy stuff, no motivational speeches, no nothing like that, no soft communication. He just needed hard number facts, like a guy who had the mind of an engineer. And then he said he had another officer who was very soft and who was very human oriented and who was a lot more loose, but also extremely good at the human side of things. And he said when he gave orders to one or the other, he gave those orders in a very different way. And I said, oh, and I thought that part of being in the army was about realizing that everybody gets trained to receive the orders in the same way. And he said, yeah, but most of it is about training so much that you know who can carry the heavy load, and you know who's good with the machine gun under fire, and you know who's good with the machine gun when it's relaxed, and you know who's going to carry the others when they're down, and you know who has the emotional strength, and you know who has the physical, and you know who'll take that extra watch, and you know who is grumpy when they haven't slept, because you train so much with the same people before the mission. Right? Most militaries don't actually spend that much time on actual military missions. They spent a ton of time training. And their opinions, both the guy I heard on the podcast and my friend, was that what it does is you get very good at understanding the people you work with and understanding different types of people. So they said for them, it was very much the opposite. It wasn't about putting everybody into one mold, which was a little bit my prejudice about armies, and probably true in some, but it was about getting so good at understanding the actual humans that you could work together. So, okay, this guy will always, this is the brave guy. Whenever we need somebody brave, he's our guy. This is the not so brave guy, but he'll think an extra time. Or this is the guy who's always got an attention to detail. Or this is the guy who will joke around a lot, but who will also, when you tell him to shut up, he'll actually do it. Right. And that to me, there was something there about how you work with teams, that it's not about shaping the team necessarily into a certain way, but it's about learning who can you joke with, who can't you joke with, who's going to be late, but wonderful, who's never late, but maybe doesn't take extra initiative, or like people are balanced and people have good sides and bad.
Yeah.
And find out what those good sides are. Then instead of taking that team member who's always late and saying you're off the team because you're late, then saying, okay, what do you bring then?
Yeah.
Sure, we'll accept that you're late, but you need to bring something else to the table.
I love that. I'm thinking about, like, as you're mentioning it, I'm thinking about, like, I'm creating a garden shed, who's going to be in the front of the garden? Who's going to be in the back of the garden? Who's going to be cleaning up the garden? Who's going to be lock up the garden? Who's going to be like, kind of putting the seed down on the ground, kind of metaphorically thinking about those kind of things. Because 5, actually, like, I love the number 5. It's not too many, right? It's not too little. So you have a good number of people to take charge on certain things. And so, yeah, I'll have a lot of fun starting next week.
I love that. And I think part of it, I've spent many years doing events of various kinds. And one of the things that I discovered, I'm sure somebody out there has done some interesting theory on it, but one of the things I discovered was that I could sort people into three strengths, usually. There were creators, the ones who were good at sitting somewhere, coming up with an idea and said, shouldn't we do a music festival? Or shouldn't we do a role-playing event? Or shouldn't we create something? And then they would make it happen out of thin air, right? Not alone, but they would go from loose idea to actual happening. Those were the creators. Then there were the cultivators, the ones who would take that music festival on the third year and say, guys, this is great, but maybe let's have like a little bit of structure here. Maybe let's write down our recruiting process, and maybe let's finally fix the accounting, and maybe let's make sure that we have a system for how we book the bands or how we take the payment, right? So the ones who could take something somebody else had created and then they would help give it more shape, the cultivators. And then finally we had the caretakers, those who would come in the 20th time and say, okay, everything's functioning and I don't want to break it. I just want to make it even more smooth. And I'm fine working on something that's already in existence. And I found people who are good at one. I found people who are good at two. I don't think yet I've found anybody who's good at all three. Because there are some people who are great creators and they're okay cultivators. They're great at making something happen. That's me. I'm really good at getting stuff into existence. I'm reasonably okay at being a cultivator. I'm reasonably okay at saying, okay, now it exists. Now let's make it better. Now let's get the process in place and let's standardize and let's make sure it can run without being this massive chaos.
Yeah.
I'm a terrible caretaker. You give me something that's been running for 30 years, and my first response will be, let's break it. Let's change it. Let's do massive things. When somebody says, no, Klaus, this is good. We need you to do it, and we need you to keep doing it. And we need you to, yes, do a little bit, but not break it totally. I'm not good at that. And I've met other people who are brilliant there. They come in, something's been running for 10 years or 100 episodes or whatever it is, and they say, wow, here's a model and it works. I am delighted to look at the small things and make sure the wheels just run smoothly. They're the ones who will get up and polish the silverware every morning to make it shine instead of trying to rearrange it or think maybe we don't need silverware at all. What can we think about, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure that whatever discipline you're in and whatever profession people have, there are these, maybe it's not three types, but there are different kind of types of people who are good at some things and not so good at others. And just realizing that on some of the teams I've run, realizing that somebody was an excellent cultivator, but a terrible creator, made it very much easier for me to understand why that project never got off the ground, even though this person was brilliant with projects that were already in existence. And I thought, okay, now I understand, right?
Yeah.
Figure out what do people like? What are they good at? Where are their strengths?
I love that. Oh my God, this three CCC, three C's. And also, because I was thinking about, I listened to some of your talks, and one of the things that really stood out to me was you were dungeon master.
I have a past in role playing. This is true.
Yeah. So I've never played Dungeons and Dragons in my whole life until pandemic. I got a call from a friend and said, hey, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. Would you like to come and play? So I said, okay. So I signed up. I thought it would be an hour, right? I got in. This is the first time, and he does this beautiful scene painting of like us coming into the fort, like a beautiful shore, and there is an inn, and he paints everything. So I'm now in the scene. An hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, 3 hours goes by, and I'm like, when does this end? And he's like, usually minimum 3 hours. So I'm like I will not be able to do that. But what really stood out to me in that experience that I never had before was the moment of scene painting. I've never went into a game where somebody actually paints a scene where we are entering. And so I thought that was really interesting that we're not playing the game yet, but there is this kind of like setting the scene where we're going to be entering. And I've been kind of like, thinking about, I'm starting a new journey, but it's not my own journey. It's the team's journey as well. So as I was thinking about Dungeon Masters and, like Dungeons and Dragons, thinking about how do I really create that scene painting where people can really immerse themselves into the place we're going. So I just, since you're a dungeon master, I figure like I gotta ask boss this question.
I'm happy you do. And I'm also happy because I can give you not only a little bit of that, which I will in a moment, but also a little bit of neuroscience theory that might be interesting to you.
Mm,
There's a concept in neuroscience called neural coupling. Are you familiar with this?
no, tell me.
So neural coupling is essentially if I tell you a story and I do it using words that make sense to you and a tone of voice that makes sense and in a language you understand and the mood is right and all these sorts of things are in order, then the neurons that are firing in my brain when I'm telling the story will also be firing in your brain.
Yeah.
Right? That's communication. If I say, imagine a red car, then probably the red car you're imagining is not the red car I'm imagining. But if I say, imagine a red Ferrari driving down an Italian mountain road, you're sitting in it,
Yeah.
the windscreen is off, you have, or like the caleche is off, and you have wind in your hair, and you're going a little bit too fast, but not dangerously so, then probably the picture I have in my mind that I'm painting is more or less the same one you have. Not exactly, but more or less the same. And that's because there's a reasonably high level of neural coupling. And there's a professor at Princeton, or he was, I don't know if he's still there, called Uri Hasson, who makes the argument that the higher the level of neural coupling, the higher the level of understanding between two people. So from a communication standpoint, if you can get a high level of neural coupling, get those same neurons firing in the speaker and the listener, then you have a pretty high transfer of information. And that doesn't necessarily mean you agree, right? If I tell you, Lee, I'm going to come over to your house, I'm going to open the door slowly, it's going to be 3 a.m, and then I'm going to plant explosive and blow up your house. They're like, I understand you, Klaus. My neurons are firing, but I do not like it. Luckily, that's not where we're going, right? So it's not about do you like it or not, but it's about do you understand?
Yeah.
And one of the things that often goes wrong in communication, well, yes, do we like it or not? But it's also often we simply don't understand. And neural coupling is useful as a concept for trying to make the other person understand. And that's where we get to the dungeon master stuff, the storyteller stuff, which is why the Uri Hasson example is part of the storytelling training I've done with a lot of people. Because once you understand that, then you understand, okay, maybe speaking in language that people understand and in pictures of the mind makes it easier for them to understand that. And being a dungeon master in something like Dungeons and Dragons or a role-playing system is excellent training because you're literally, as you say, you're painting pictures that then appear in the audience's mind, or in this case, the player's mind. And that as skill training is insanely good skill training for communication about other stuff. So if you have somebody in a group and you'd like to get better at communicating with that group, well, one thing is something like Dungeons and Dragons can be quite fun, but it's also excellent skill training because if you paint a picture that the others don't understand, then not only are you not a super good dungeon master, probably, but it also means that you're having trouble with communication and vice versa. So I love that you use that example. And I think what I would draw from that is the essence of role-playing games, right? Dungeons and Dragons is both the storytelling and the universe and the rules and the characters and all that sort of thing. But at the essence is this telling stories. And sometimes just doing a simple exercise with people where you train them in telling stories can be pretty damn useful, right? One thing is, let's say we are 5 people in our group and you say, I'm going to tell you something. I'm gonna explain something to you. I'm gonna share a story, and I want you to draw what you hear. And then afterwards you look at the drawings and see how different they are, and then you can laugh about it together, and then you can say, okay, where did it go wrong, or what worked right, or what do they have in common, that sort of thing. Because even though it's simple and short, it can also be quite fun and can illustrate, oh, so when I wrote doctor, one of you drew a picture of a man in his 50s, and another of you pictured a woman in her 20s. Interesting. Why is that? And suddenly you have a useful conversation, right?
Yeah.
Where it may be not easy to think, oh, Dungeons and Dragons leads to that sort of thing. But in fact, it's very easy once you've looked at storytelling from a role-playing perspective and then say, okay, how do you take some of the same ideas and put them into storytelling in a communications or team perspective? So thanks for sharing that example.
Yeah, so now since you talked about role playing, I'm also thinking about, because innovation kind of future planning is about setting up the vision as well, collective vision that is currently does not exist, but hopefully it will exist in the future. And as a team, do you use any kind of role play or storytelling to envision the future together?
Oh, yes.
And how would you do that?
Yes, definitely. So there are a couple of things here that might be useful, and if not, then just ignore them, right? So here are a couple of things that I both do and have done and have seen done effectively. One is by giving people clear roles. Are you familiar with the six thinking hats of De Bono?
Yes.
Yes, perfect example, right? Perfect example. You are the black hat. You're supposed to look at the dangers and the negatives and the fears, etc. So now you have license to be that person who's afraid, right? You are the white hat. You're going to look at, et cetera, et cetera. You're the blue hat. You're the process hat. So you're going to look at how do we get there? What are their systems? It's a beautiful example of how to give clear roles, because suddenly now people have an alibi to say those things that are on their mind from that lens. Now you could do that, and instead of using thinking hats, you could just as well say, okay, you are the CFO of our company in this discussion, right? So we're going to pitch this idea to further up the line, and now we're going to have the meeting that says, you are the CFO, you're the marketing officer, you're the board member who has invested a lot of money but isn't really hands-on. But we have a rough idea of these things, and then we're going to play that meeting like as a strategy exercise. Or one of the things my friend Brian Mattimore, who I've written a couple of innovation books with, uses the concept of strategic wargaming, where you essentially say, okay, we're now going to pretend that we're the competition.
Ah.
If you are Apple and you're creating a new phone, then they pretend for maybe half a day or a day or something like that, that they are now Samsung's product teams that are trying to develop a new phone to beat the iPhone. And suddenly they are now taking on the roles of Samsung engineers and Samsung marketers and Samsung executives. And then somebody's taking notes and listening to that, and then realizing, hey, wait a minute. In that discussion about visual branding, they said some interesting things that we can use in our own discussions. Oh my God, we'd never have realized that if we hadn't done this strategic war game.
Yeah.
So that's one way I've seen it done very effectively. Another, which I recently heard, I think he was a Swedish researcher, and he said that this way of past futures or future pasts is, it's very easy. If I ask you, and I'll use the example he gave because it was lovely. He said, in 3 years, the Swiss railroads, the Swiss national railroads in Switzerland have been bought, 60% of that company, of the railroad organization, in 3 years has been bought by Chinese investors. How did we get here? And then look back to what could have got us there. Where if you ask people in 3 years, do you think that 60% of the Swiss railroad system will be bought by Chinese investors? Of course, people will say, no, why would it? Like that's not, is that deal going on? And what do you mean? And then it's a discussion of yes or no. And usually the answer is no to some a little bit far out scenarios. But if you say, let's imagine it's 2028 and Chinese investors now own 60% of the Swiss railroads, how did we get here? And then you have discussions, and they could lead 1,000 ways, and none of them are right.
Yeah.
But suddenly it begins some discussions, right? And if you use this to say, in a month, we have 1,000 new customers, how did we get there, is much more interesting than saying, can we have 1,000 new customers in a month?
Yeah, I got chills when you said that. Like, because I'm, thinking about all the possibilities that all of a sudden opens up because it happened.
Yes.
You were saying it happened, right? In 2028, it happened. So there must be a reason why.
Bingo.
And so now I have to come up with possibilities rather than kind of arguing against, that's impossible. Why would that happen? Well,
bingo, right?
I have seen the future.
Yes, and it's a little bit that. It's a little bit saying, what if instead of discussing whether a future was realistic, what if we saw that future? How can we draw lines back to that?
Yeah.
And it's a very different thought exercise.
Yeah.
And what his point was, he showed this, and he gave that example to a room with 1,000 people in it. And he said, I'm sure, and he just asked us to talk to the person next to us. And he said, I'm sure that you're right now, 500 conversations are happening, and they're all different, but they are happening. Where if I just asked you, how could this happen? Most of you would say it couldn't.
Yeah. No, I love that idea. I think I'm going to, because that could also, as you said, it could work in a positive way, right? Because they like, hey, our workspace have been awarded with, number one in China. All of a sudden, people are looking up for our workspace design. How did we get here?
Bingo.
Like 3 years ago, nobody was paying attention to us, right? And then now we can think about, well, we brought in theater people, like all kind of new kind of ideas can come up, but we can bring it to this place and really think about the possibilities rather than yes or no, as you said.
Exactly, exactly. And I think if you take that and you combine some of these things, then it gets really interesting. Let's say you have your team of 5 and you say, let's use the Swiss railroad example again, because it's simple, right? And you say, okay, here's the example, Chinese investors, 60% Swiss railroads in 2028. And then you give each of them a persona and you say, you are going to tell us how it happened because of trouble. You are going to tell us how it happened because of opportunity. You are going to tell us how it happened because of technology. You're going to tell us how it happened because of tourism. And then you get some very, very interesting scenarios that are different from each other because you're assigning not only this future to think from, but you're also giving them roles and the alibi to think differently than they normally do because you're allowing them to pretend to be somebody else. And a little bit of this, there's also the last trick I'll give, which is something that I tried when I studied philosophy at the university 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago. No, actually more. 26 years ago, the first time, is that we were told, here's a complex dilemma. I think it was some ethical dilemma. And you're now going to have half an hour to prepare. We're going to divide you into 2 teams. You're going to have half an hour to prepare arguments for this ethical dilemma. There's a clear position. There are 2 clear positions, and you're going to have half an hour to prepare. And then just before you go on stage, the debate stage, we're going to tell you what your position is. So you need to be prepared to argue for either A or B convincingly. And then we're going to tell you what your opinion is just before you go on stage. Where it's very often that when we talk to people, they have an opinion. And if you ask them, then they'll try to defend that opinion.
Yeah.
There's a simple trick inspired by this that I've used sometimes with working with groups. I'd say, great, here's this solution. You hate that solution, right? They're like, yes, this solution is terrible. It would never work. I say, great. Now imagine for a moment, you are people who believe in this solution. What would you tell? How would you preach it if you were one of those? If you were one of those people on the other side, how would you preach it? They say, well, some of them go like, well, I wouldn't because it doesn't make sense. And then somebody else goes, yeah, but you know what? Okay, if I was there, I'd say it's good for this, or maybe it's cheaper, or maybe it's more organic, or maybe it's culturally appropriate, or maybe it's just more fun, and then usually some things emerge like, oh, this is actually not as bad as I thought. Oh, okay. So now instead of just saying uncritically no to this opposite position, now we can say no in a nuanced way. And maybe we even change our minds on some things. And doing this is not only interesting and fun, usually, but it's also a great way to get a team to play together in a different way because you're giving them alibi to play around with identity, to play around with roles, to play around with opinions, because you're saying, let's pretend, imagine if.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, how do you all feel about minimum wage, or how do you feel about whatever workplace thing it is, then they're going to have opinions and they're going to be well thought out and they're going to be worried about pissing off each other. But if you're saying, now imagine, and let's talk about it, right? Get people to play is a good way of getting to know them.
Yeah. I love it. I think I'm ready for the next week.
See, that also fits perfectly with our time frame here because we're getting to the wrap up of this. And that means I want to do 2 things. The first is I want to thank you for not only for bringing this challenge to me, really interesting and really fun, and thanks, but also for bringing it to our listeners. That takes generosity of spirit and courage to share because we're hopefully going to inspire somebody out there who's thinking, you know what? that Lee woman, that Klaus guy, they said some interesting stuff. I can use that. Thank you. So thanks for that is the first thing. The second is I want you to take a moment and I want you to think of 3 things you take away from our conversation. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be things they're going to do, they can be things you disagree with like crazy. That's also okay. But 3 things that are going to stick with you after this conversation, and share them, of course.
Well, first of all, I think, what you mentioned last first, which is treat this as a play. I think that's really wonderful way to get the team to come together. And number 2 was give trust first before ask for trust. And then number 3, where you mentioned about you're not bringing the team to be the same. We're actually bringing teams to be so that their strength shines and then the team collectively can perform the best. So these 3 things are really kind of something that I'm going to take away from this conversation. And I would like to say thank you so much for taking time and giving ideas and just to playing with, some tricky situations that I am facing right now, but I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And to all of you out there listening to our conversation, this has been the Innovation Coaching Podcast. You've heard Lee Kim, and you've heard me, your host, Klaus Hostel. Thank you for listening.